The first time I noticed my eggs going missing, I thought maybe I had forgotten I'd used them, but then it happened again and again. Every single week, my egg carton would be half empty when I had barely cracked 2. That's when I caught them, the Karen sisters, my neighbors from hell, slipping into my backyard chicken coop like it was their personal grocery store. Their smug grins and loud laughs echoed in my head long after they'd walked away with baskets full of my eggs. I wanted to scream, but instead, I smiled to myself. They thought they were clever, stealing from me right under my nose. But if they loved my eggs so much, I'd give them exactly what they wanted. They wouldn't just be taking eggs anymore, they'd be stealing a ticking surprise. So, one morning, while they smirked and strutted across my lawn, I swapped out the fresh ones for something very different. Fertilized eggs. Real ones that carried life inside them. They never knew what hit them until it was far too late. Asterisk, I've always believed that peace in life comes from simple things. For me, it was my little backyard garden, a wooden chicken coop painted white, and the soft clucking of hens that greeted me every morning. Their eggs were my pride, fresh, golden-yolked and warm when collected in the palm of my hand. I sold a few at the farmer's market, shared some with neighbors, and kept the rest for myself. It wasn't just about food, it was about rhythm and routine, the quiet joy of being self-sufficient. For years, that little coop was my calm corner of the world until the Karen sisters moved in next door. From the moment they arrived, the peace was gone. You couldn't miss them. They were loud, always yelling at delivery drivers, screaming at landscapers, and gossiping so loudly that even with my windows closed I could hear every word. Their hair was always styled too perfectly, their clothes always too flashy, and their voices cut through the air like knives. Nobody liked them, but nobody dared to say anything either, because the Karen sisters thrived on conflict. If they weren't complaining, they weren't breathing. At first I thought I could avoid them. I kept my head down, smiled politely when forced to, and hoped they would leave me alone. But the first sign of trouble came one Sunday morning, when I went to gather eggs. I had counted 6 the night before, but in the morning only 2 were left. I frowned, checked the coop carefully, and even looked around to see if maybe one of the hens had laid elsewhere. Nothing. I shrugged it off. Maybe I'd miscounted, or maybe a raccoon had gotten to them. But it happened again and again. Every week, more eggs vanished. My hens didn't look stressed, and the coop was secure. It didn't make sense. It wasn't until one evening, when I stepped out quietly to put away garden tools, that I saw them, 2 shadows slipping across my yard. The Karen sisters, one held a wicker basket, the other a flashlight. They walked straight into my coop like they owned it. My heart pounded as I crouched behind the shed and watched. They didn't even sneak. They giggled, plucking eggs from the nests with greedy little hands. When the basket was full, they strutted away, whispering like schoolgirls sharing a secret. I stood frozen, furious, my fists clenched, my jaw tight. I wanted to shout, to storm over and demand they give everything back. But instead, I just stared at the dark outline of their house as the porch light flicked on. The sisters disappeared inside, laughing. The next morning, I decided to be direct. I knocked on their door. The older sister, Margot, opened it, her lips already pursed in irritation. "What?" she snapped, as if I'd disturbed something important. I swallowed the anger bubbling in my chest. "I know you've been taking my eggs," I said calmly. "Those are from my chickens. I need you to stop." Behind her, the younger one, Trisha, burst into laughter. "Are you serious? They're just eggs. You've got plenty." "They're mine," I said firmly. "It's stealing." Margot rolled her eyes and leaned against the doorframe. "Oh, relax. You sell them, don't you? Consider it community sharing. We're neighbors." "No," I said, my voice sharpening. "Neighbors ask. Neighbors don't sneak around at night." For a moment, we locked eyes. I could see the challenge in hers, that smug defiance people like her wore like armor. Then she smirked, slammed the door in my face, and that was the end of the conversation. From then on, the thefts got worse. Every week, more eggs disappeared. Sometimes entire cartons I had set aside for the market. It wasn't just about the eggs anymore. It was the principle, the violation of my space, the smug way they dared me to stop them. I started waking up earlier, hoping to catch them, but they always seemed one step ahead. Sometimes I'd hear their laughter drifting through the night as they carried off what was mine. The other neighbors noticed, too. Mrs. Lane from across the street mentioned one morning how the sisters had bragged about their endless fresh eggs at a neighborhood coffee. "It must be nice to have so many hens," she said, not realizing they were mine. My blood boiled. They weren't just stealing from me. They were parading their theft as if it were an accomplishment. One night, after another basketful disappeared, I sat at my kitchen table staring at the empty carton. My hands trembled with fury. I thought of calling the police, but what would I say? My neighbors are stealing eggs. They'd laugh me out of the station. I thought of confronting them again, but I knew they'd only mock me. The Karen sisters, you didn't care about rules. They thrived on getting away with things. I stared out the window at the moonlight glowing over the coop. My hens were asleep, feathers fluffed, safe in their roosts. They trusted me to protect them, and I had failed. That was when the thought crept into my mind, quiet at first, but growing stronger. If they wanted eggs so badly, maybe I should give them eggs they wouldn't forget. I leaned back in my chair, the idea taking shape. Fertilized eggs, not the harmless ones I sold, but the ones that held more inside them. I knew how to get them. I knew exactly what it would mean. The image made me smile for the first time in weeks. The sisters thought they were clever. They thought they could steal from me forever, laughing all the way. But they had no idea the game was about to change. After that night at the kitchen table, the thought wouldn't leave me. It clung to me in every quiet moment, the idea of teaching the Karen sisters a lesson they wouldn't forget. I fed the hens the next morning, their soft clucks surrounding me, and as I collected the warm eggs in my basket, the plan simmered at the back of my mind. These were normal, unfertilized eggs, harmless, but I knew if I introduced a rooster into the flock, the game would change. Fertilized eggs weren't like these. They carried life, and if kept warm long enough, they would hatch out all day. I carried that thought like a secret flame. I went about my chores, smiled at Mrs. Lane when she waved from her porch, even stopped by the farmer's market to sell a few dozen. On the outside, nothing was different, but inside, my anger had shifted. It wasn't just rage anymore, it was focus. The Karen sisters had mocked me, laughed at me, treated me like a fool. That wouldn't happen again. The thefts didn't stop. If anything, they became more brazen. One night I peeked out my window and saw them strutting straight across my lawn in broad moonlight, not even bothering to sneak anymore. Trisha carried a wicker basket tucked under her arm like some kind of prize purse, while Margot shone her phone's flashlight into the coop. They weren't just stealing, they were taunting me, daring me to confront them. I clenched my fists so tightly my nails dug crescents into my palms. Every instinct screamed to storm out and stop them, but I held back. No, I couldn't ruin it. Now, if I wanted this to work, I needed patience. The next morning, I drove out to a farm 2 towns over where an old man named Harris raised roosters. His property was sprawling, the air filled with crowing and the earthy scent of hay. I told him I needed a healthy young rooster to round out my flock. He grinned knowingly, looking for chicks down the line. Huh. I nodded, though the truth was darker than he'd ever guessed. I picked out a glossy red rooster with a proud stance and a piercing cry. Harris loaded him into a crate, and by the time I drove home, the plan felt real. Introducing him to the hens was easy. They accepted him quickly, and soon the rhythm of the coop changed. The quiet clucking grew livelier, the hens more restless. Within a week, the eggs I collected were different, fertilized, life waiting in fragile shells. I held one up to the light, feeling the weight of what I carried. A smile tugged at my lips. These weren't just eggs anymore, they were traps. The waiting was the hardest part. Fertilized eggs didn't change overnight. They needed warmth, time, patience. The sisters, of course, didn't notice. They kept stealing with the same smugness, proudly walking away with baskets full. Each time I saw them leave, my heart beat faster. They thought they were winning, they thought they were clever, but I knew the truth. Every theft brought them closer to their own undoing. Meanwhile, their arrogance grew unbearable. I overheard them one afternoon bragging on the sidewalk. "Our omelets are the fluffiest," Trisha laughed. "You just can't beat fresh eggs." Margot smirked and added, "And the best part, they're free." They weren't even trying to hide it anymore. Neighbors glanced their way with raised eyebrows, but no one said a word. People avoided the Karens. They were too loud, too cruel, too eager for a fight. I kept quiet, but inside I seethed. Every word they spoke was another log on the fire. And yet, I also felt something else, anticipation, because I knew what they didn't. The eggs they carried home were ticking clocks. At night I would lie awake imagining the moment I pictured, Margot cracking one into a pan only to watch in horror as something moved inside. I imagined Trisha shrieking as tiny cracks spread across the shell on her countertop. My mind replayed it again and again, each version more satisfying than the last. One evening, about 3 weeks after I'd brought home the rooster, I caught them again in the act. They giggled as usual, stuffing eggs into their basket. But this time, something in me shifted. Instead of fury, I felt calm. I leaned against the window frame and watched, my lips curling into a smile. Let them take them. Let them laugh. Their downfall was already sealed. The following week I noticed something strange. The sisters weren't strutting quite as confidently. Margot walked faster, glancing around nervously, and Trisha clutched the basket closer to her chest. It still came, but there was tension in their movements. I wondered if maybe they'd noticed a change, if one of the eggs had cracked oddly, or if they'd seen something inside. My pulse quickened at the thought. The trap was tightening. Then, one morning, Mrs. Lane knocked on my door. She leaned in conspiratorially, lowering her voice. "You'll never believe this," she whispered. "The sisters have been complaining. Said some of the eggs they took from you were strange. One even made them gag when they cracked it open. I think they're scared." She chuckled softly, shaking her head. "Serves them right." I hid my smile, nodding politely. "Well," I said, "maybe they'll stop stealing then." But I knew better. The Karens weren't the type to stop out of decency. They would keep pushing until the lesson hit them full force. That night, I stood by the coop longer than usual, listening to the soft rustle of feathers and the rooster's low crow. I felt a strange mix of emotions. Anger still burned in me, yes, but beneath it was something sharper. Satisfaction. I wasn't just protecting my hens anymore. I was fighting back. As the moon climbed high and the neighborhood went quiet, I whispered to myself, soon, and for the first time since the sisters had moved in. I slept soundly, knowing revenge was no longer just a dream. It was inevitable. The morning began like any other. I was pulling weeds in the garden, enjoying the crisp air, when I heard a shriek so loud it sent a flock of crows scattering from the trees. My head snapped toward the Karen sisters' house. Another scream followed, this one even more frantic, high-pitched, desperate. My lips curved slowly into a smile. It had begun. I straightened, brushing dirt from my gloves, and listened. The noise carried clearly across the fence. Slamming doors, hurried footsteps, and Trisha's panicked voice yelling, "Oh my God, it's moving, Margot, it's moving." My heart pounded, not from fear, but from exhilaration. I knew exactly what they had seen. An egg doesn't lie. When it's been fertilized and kept warm long enough, life begins to stir inside. For weeks they'd stolen from me without a care, but now their prize omelets were turning into something else entirely. I forced myself to keep working, resisting the urge to rush closer. I tugged at weeds with unnecessary vigor, pretending to be too focused to notice. Still, my ears stayed sharp. "Throw it out." Margot's voice bellowed from inside. "Get it out of the kitchen." "I can't." It's cracking," Trisha wailed, her words breaking into a sob. I imagined the scene there, spotless granite countertops smeared with bits of shell, their perfect little kitchen echoing with tiny chirps. I pictured them recoiling as Yellow Down pushed through, a broken shell, beady eyes blinking at them. The image was so vivid I nearly laughed aloud. Moments later, their front door burst open. Trisha stumbled out, clutching a bowl. She ran into the yard, gagging, and hurled the contents into the grass. Even from my distance, I saw shattered shells scatter. A weak chirp carried through the air before she screamed and bolted back inside. My hens clucked from the coop, stirred by the commotion. I murmured to them soothingly, "Don't worry, girls. Justice is being served." The rest of the morning was chaos. The sisters argued so loudly that half the street could hear. Margot shouted about disgusting creatures ruining her breakfast, while Trisha whimpered that she couldn't get the image out of her head. At one point, I saw Margot storm out to the trash bin with a plastic bag, her face twisted in rage. She slammed the lid so hard it rattled, then stomped back inside. By noon, word had already spread. Mrs. Lane from across the street strolled over, her eyes bright with curiosity. "You hear the racket?" she whispered. "Sounds like they found something nasty in their eggs. Serves them right, don't you think?" I only smiled faintly. Maybe they'll think twice next time, but I knew better. The Karens weren't the type to stop when embarrassed. If anything, this was just the beginning of their unraveling. That evening, as the sun dipped low, I caught sight of Trisha. Through their kitchen window, she stood with her arms crossed, glaring at a carton of eggs on the counter. She picked one up, turned it over in her hand, then set it down quickly, as if it might explode. Margot entered, gesturing wildly, clearly arguing. I couldn't hear the words, but their body language told the story. Distrust had begun to creep in, even between them. Later, their voices rang out again, this time from the backyard. I crouched by my coop and listened. "They can't all be bad," Margot insisted. "Maybe it was just one weird one. You just didn't see it moving," Trisha snapped. "I heard it. It was alive." "Margot, don't be dramatic," Margot barked. "We'll just cook them quicker next time. Heat kills anything." I stifled a laugh. They still didn't understand. They thought this was about spoiled food, about chance. They had no idea that every egg they took now carried the same secret. That night, I lay in bed awake, staring at the ceiling for the first time since their thefts began. I felt peace, but it wasn't the calm peace of my old routine. It was sharper, more intoxicating. Revenge hummed in my veins, sweet and powerful. I drifted to sleep imagining them cracking more eggs, each one worse than the last. The next morning delivered exactly that. Around 9, I was sipping coffee on the porch when their kitchen window flew open. A shriek echoed, followed by my furious shout, "Why won't they stop?" Then came the sound of glass shattering, an egg thrown violently against the sink or floor. Trisha ran out again, clutching her head with both hands. She paced the yard, muttering frantically, "They're alive, they're alive, they're alive," over and over, like a broken record. She looked pale, her hair a mess. Neighbors began to notice. Curtains twitched. A man walking his dog paused, watching her meltdown. Whispers spread quickly. Everyone had always known the Karen sisters were trouble, but now they looked unhinged. I kept my expression neutral, though inside I was giddy. The sisters were unraveling, and the neighborhood was watching. By late afternoon, the house had grown eerily quiet. No more shouting, no more banging, but silence often speaks louder than noise. I imagined them inside, hovering over every egg with suspicion, debating whether to risk another crack. As twilight fell, I took a slow walk to the edge of my yard. Through their kitchen window, I caught a glimpse of a carton on the counter. Margot hovered near it, her posture tense while Trisha sat slumped at the table, her face buried in her hands. I couldn't hear their words, but the tension was palpable. The rooster crowed behind me, sharp and triumphant. I smiled. He didn't know it, but he was my co-conspirator, the silent hand behind this revenge. That night I dreamed vividly. I saw the Karen's pristine kitchen flooded with chicks' teeny yellow bodies darting across the floor, cheeping madly as the sisters screamed and swatted with dish towels. I saw eggs cracking in unison, shells splitting, life spilling into their a spotless world of control and entitlement. When I woke, my heart was pounding, my mouth dry. It hadn't happened yet, but it would. The dream felt like a promise. By the end of the week, the sisters stopped stealing in the dead of night. They came during the day instead, rushing in nervously, grabbing fewer eggs at a time, their eyes darting like thieves who'd lost their confidence. That change alone told me they were afraid but still greedy enough not to stop. And that was perfect. Because the best revenge isn't quick, it's slow. It's watching your enemy walk willingly into the trap you've laid, over and over, until they're so tangled they can't escape. As I watched them that evening, stumbling back to their house with their precious eggs, I whispered softly to myself, it's only just beginning. The first sign of trouble came on a Tuesday morning. I was out back, refilling the chicken's water trough, when I noticed smoke curling faintly from the Karen sisters' kitchen window. It wasn't fire, at least not yet. It was steam, heavy and thick, pouring out like they were boiling something alive. Moments later I heard the crash of a pot lid clattering to the floor, followed by a scream so sharp it made my hens startle and flap their wings. I froze, listening. Then came another sound, unmistakable this time, frantic chirping, not one chick, but several. The high-pitched peeps carried across the yard, cutting through the sisters' shrieks. My heart leapt with satisfaction. It was happening. The window banged open, and Trisha leaned out, her hair wild, her face pale with panic. She hurled a saucepan into the yard, and with it tumbled 3 soggy half-hatched chicks, cheeping desperately as they hit the grass. She gagged and vanished back inside, her screams echoing. Margot's voice bellowed a moment later, "Get them out of the house, all of them." I leaned casually on my fence, pretending to adjust a loose board, but my eyes never left their house. The chaos inside was palpable, crashing, stomping, the sound of chairs scraping, and over it all, the ceaseless chirping of new life bursting into their perfect sterile kitchen. Within minutes, the front door flew open. Margot stumbled out carrying a mixing bowl filled with broken shells and squirming yellow fluff. She looked horrified, muttering curses under her breath as she dumped the contents onto the lawn. A chick wriggled free and darted toward the hedge, cheeping loudly. Neighbors were beginning to notice. Curtains slid back. A car slowed as it passed. Then came the moment that sealed their fate. Trisha bolted out next, cradling a carton. But instead of eggs, the shells inside were already cracking, tiny beaks breaking through. One popped open in her very hands, and a damp chick tumbled onto her wrist. She screamed so loudly it made the neighborhood dogs bark. She dropped the carton, and eggs burst across the driveway, spilling chicks onto the concrete. They scattered in every direction, their fragile bodies wriggling toward freedom, their chirps piercing the air. The sight was mesmerizing, life erupting from every shell, chaos spilling onto the street. By now, half the block was watching. Mrs. Lane stood on her porch, covering her mouth in shock. Mr. Jenkins from 2 houses down walked right up to the sidewalk, chuckling openly. "Well, would you look at that?" he muttered loud enough for others to hear. "Looks like the ladies' free groceries came with a surprise." The sisters were frantic. Margot ran in circles, trying to stomp near the chicks without touching them. "Disgusting, filthy things," she yelled, flapping her arms helplessly. Trisha, on the other hand, looked on the verge of collapse, clutching her hair, repeating, "They're everywhere, Margot, they're everywhere." And they were. The chicks spread across their driveway, their front yard, even fluttering into the street where passing cars slowed to avoid them. The sound was deafening, dozens of chirps layered over screams and curses. I stood by my fence, arms folded, watching with cool satisfaction. This was better than I had imagined. The sisters weren't just embarrassed, they were exposed. Their arrogance, their entitlement, their endless theft had led them here. And now the entire neighborhood could see their humiliation. Margot finally snapped. She grabbed a broom and began swatting at the chicks, not hitting them but waving wildly, as though she could shoo them back into unbroken shells. Her movements were frantic, jerky, almost comical. Trisha, meanwhile, tried scooping them back into a cardboard box, but the chicks kept escaping, hopping out one after another as fast as she could throw them in. The neighbors didn't bother, hiding their amusement. Laughter rippled across the street. Phones appeared, cameras recording the spectacle. Someone muttered, "That's going viral for sure." The sisters had always ruled the neighborhood with fear and intimidation, but now they looked powerless, ridiculous even. Finally, Margot spotted me. Her eyes locked on mine across the fence, full of fury and desperation. "This is your fault," she shrieked, pointing the broom like a weapon. You did this." I tilted my head, feigning innocence. "I don't know what you're talking about. You've been stealing my eggs for weeks. Sounds like you got exactly what you asked for." Gasps came from the gathered neighbors. Murmurs spread quickly, confirmation of what many had suspected but never said aloud. Mrs. Lane's eyes widened, and she shook her head slowly. "So it's true," she said under her breath. "They really were stealing." Margot's face twisted with rage, but there was no defense left. The evidence was literally running across her lawn, cheeping loudly for all to hear. Trisha dropped to her knees, sobbing, as a chick climbed onto her shoe and pecked at her laces. The scene went on for nearly an hour. Animal control eventually arrived, alerted by frantic calls from passing drivers who'd spotted chicks scattering into the street. The officer, trying not to laugh, helped gather the little creatures safely into crates. He shot the sisters a disapproving look. "Where'd you even get fertilized eggs?" he asked pointedly. Neither answered. They stood pale and trembling, surrounded by the remnants of their humiliation. By the time the last chick was collected, the sisters' reputation was ruined. The neighborhood buzzed with gossip, phones lit up with photos and videos. The once Karens were now a joke. The memory of their shrieks and flailing burned into everyone's mind. As the crowd dispersed, I slipped back into my yard, the weight of satisfaction settling warmly in my chest. My hens clucked softly as I checked on them, the rooster crowing proudly as though sharing in my triumph. I whispered to them, smiling, "Justice served." And for the first time in months I felt truly at peace. But as I washed up that night, a strange thought lingered. Revenge had been sweet, yes, but watching them crumble had sparked something darker in me, something sharper. The sisters had been punished, but a part of me wondered, was it enough? The days after the chick incident were nothing short of delicious. Word spread faster than wildfire. By the end of the week, everyone in the neighborhood had either witnessed the chaos firsthand or watched the videos circulating online. The once feared Karen sisters were no longer intimidating figures. They were laughingstocks. People pointed, chuckled, and whispered whenever they passed. Children imitated their shrieks, flapping their arms like chickens, while teenagers shared memes of them drowning in a sea of yellow fluff. For the first time in years, the neighborhood felt light. People smiled more. Conversations sparked on front porches. The heavy cloud of fear that had once hung over our block had lifted, and it was all thanks to two entitled women finally being put in their place. But the sisters didn't take their humiliation quietly. They slammed doors, cursed loudly whenever they walked outside, and glared daggers at anyone who dared smirk their way. Margot, especially, seethed with visible rage. I often caught her staring at my coop from her kitchen window, her face pale and hard as though she were plotting something. Trisha looked worse, her usual smugness replaced by jittery nerves. She jumped at every sound, shied away from neighbors, and avoided eye contact. If the humiliation hadn't broken them, the guilt had. One evening, just as the sun was sinking and painting the sky in hues of orange, they marched straight into my yard. No sneaking this time, no fake smiles. Margot's fists were balled tight, her voice shaking with fury. "You think you're clever, don't you?" she spat. "You embarrassed us. You ruined us." I leaned against the coop calmly, the rooster crowing behind me as if on cue. "I didn't ruin you. You did that yourselves. You stole from me. Actions have consequences." Trisha's eyes welled with tears, her voice barely a whisper. "You could have just said no again. You didn't have to." She trailed off, shivering at the memory. "I did say no," I replied evenly. "You didn't listen." For a moment, silence hung heavy in the air. The sisters stood trembling, torn between anger and shame, but they had no ground left to stand on. They turned abruptly and stormed away, their footsteps sharp and hollow against the pavement. From then on, they never touched my coop again. In fact, they avoided their yard entirely, their curtains drawn shut as though they could hide from the judgment of the world. When they did emerge, it was quick head down, voices hushed. They were shadows of their former selves. The neighborhood, however, thrived. People began greeting me warmly, some even dropping by to buy eggs directly. Mrs. Lane brought over fresh bread to trade for a carton, and Mr. Jenkins laughed every time he passed, calling me the Egg Avenger. The hens seemed livelier too, clucking proudly as though they sensed the victory. Weeks passed, and the sisters' bitterness curdled into retreat. Their once perfect lawn grew patchy and overgrown. Packages piled at their doorstep for days, and fewer cars appeared in their driveway. It was clear they were pulling away from the neighborhood, embarrassed and unwelcome. Then, one morning I woke to the sound of a moving truck rumbling into their driveway. My heart lifted instantly. I watched from the porch as movers carried their gaudy furniture, their boxes, their oversized mirrors. The sisters hovered anxiously, snapping at each other, but never once glancing at me or the coop. They looked smaller somehow, diminished by noon. The truck was full, and the sisters climbed into their car. For a fleeting moment, Trisha glanced my way. Her eyes were tired, hollow. Margot, however, refused to look at me, her face twisted in stubborn denial even as she pulled away. The car rolled down the street, turned the corner, and was gone. Silence felt deep and satisfying. The Karen sisters, once the terror of our block, were nothing more than a bad memory. The neighborhood belonged to us again. I walked back to the coop, running a hand over the smooth wood, listening to the gentle clucks of my hens. The rooster crowed proudly, as if declaring victory to the world. I smiled. The simple peace I had loved before was back, but sweeter now, richer, because this time it had been earned. I sat on my porch that evening, sipping tea as the sky turned dusky blue. The street was calm, neighbors laughing softly in the distance, children riding bikes, without fear. Justice had been served not with fists or fights, but with patience, cleverness, and a little poetic irony. And as the last light faded from the sky, I whispered to myself, they thought they were stealing eggs, but in the end, they hatched their own downfall. The Karen sisters were gone. My peace was restored, and for the first time in months I felt whole again.